It was at this moment he knew. He f***ed up.
Knife and dagger fighting in its various forms is ubiquitous across time and all around the globe. But can you imagine fighting with sickles? If you're familiar with the comma, this probably doesn't even seem all that weird to you. But outside of that, it's rather rare and exotic. So I wanted to dive into this topic. This is not going to be a formal instructional video, but rather an experiment of sorts. So I deviously coerced my training partner Sindri into helping out with this. Actually, he was more than happy to try out something new. And so we looked at the manuscript written by Paulus Hector Mair in the 1540s. Some people pronounce it Mair to distinguish from the other Mair, but it's really just two different spellings for the same pronunciation. It should be Mair as well. This guy was not a knight or a fencing master as such, even though it's likely that he served in the military, but rather somebody who was enthusiastic about preserving medieval martial arts. He covers the usual that he would expect: longsword, sword and buckler, rapier / side sword, etc. But he also has different weapons like staves, scythes, sickles, clubs, etc. Anyway, so let's get to it. The first step was to pick a few techniques, read and interpret them, and then try to figure out how to do them. By the way, if you like this shirt, it's available on my merch store, link below. The way Mair does it is he describes techniques in stages. So we've got step one, which is just step in and cut the other guy to the head. If he's half asleep or just doesn't respond effectively, it's over right then. Then he shows the counter to that. If the opponent does this, then you respond in such and such a way. The next phase is if you start the attack, your opponent responds with the counter that was just described, then your counter to the counter is this. So eventually we end up with this chain of techniques. You do this, they do that, you do this to respond. And this may seem a little bit stiff when seen at first. It may seem a little bit artificial because, well, it is. In order to learn and practice the technique, you have to do it step by step. You have to break it up, and then you have to do it with a compliant partner at first, of course, to even be able to figure it out. And then after that, you try it under pressure, which is why we did sparring later on. You'll see that. But first, a few more of the other techniques. My interpretations may very well be off. There are always different ways to interpret the manuscripts because, well, the language is not always 100% clear and unambiguous. And of course, also, we just have individual pictures. We don't have the entire sequence shown in multiple pictures, unfortunately. When you look at these, the overall pattern that emerges is simple. You alternate between attacking with your main hand and catching the opponent's arm with your offhand, try to control, and then attack again, which makes perfect sense. You need to control their weapon and land a hit with your own. So that's basically the same as in knife or dagger fighting. However, sickles complicate things a little bit. There were situations where we would have been successful in defending if not for the curved blade sneakily finding its way past the defense and getting the arm anyway, which a knife or dagger wouldn't have been able to. Alright, let's talk more action. Keep in mind that even though both of us have plenty of experience with swords, this was sort of a crash course foray into sickle fighting, and obviously not representative of what somebody might be able to do after many years of practicing these techniques. But definitely a fun experiment. In sparring against a fully resisting opponent, of course, it doesn't look so clean. And it's easy to screw up the techniques. Here, for example, I tried to displace the cut, but I didn't push outward far enough, so the blade went straight through my defense. And of course there's more dynamic movement, shifting the body back and forth, little twitches to keep the opponent guessing about your intentions, etc. And of course trying to snipe the opponent's hands and arms, which is generally one of your safest options. Not something I'd expect to be written down in the manuscript because it's pretty self-evident. I think we got like a general grasp for people who haven't practiced it extensively. Some of the techniques seem a little bit contrived at first glance. And at first when you try them out, you're like, what, huh? What? Like, for example, why would you keep your left hand under the right? But it makes sense because you want it to be available, because we're doing a lot of checking and grabbing. So I want to, if he comes in with some kind of cut, I want to have this already here so I can immediately displace his arm and do something about it, as opposed to if we're here, like he cuts, now I got to bring it all the way up. It takes quite a bit longer. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with keeping the hand here in front of the chest, because now it's like he cuts, I defend, it's here. Like, it's not as fast as having it right here, obviously, but it's still pretty fast. The one weird one I find is where he goes for the foot of all things, like covering the inside of the arm, and then he wants to go for the foot, which is pretty strange, because if I'm here on his inside, why am I not cutting to his head or to his arm or whatever? Like, but different options. Like, if you want to just disable them instead of kill them, I guess, something like that. Same thing with this. This seems pretty weird at first, like why would you do this? But again, it's for this sort of purpose. If he cuts, I catch it here, the hand is already there, boom, boom, then he catches it, and this exact exchange is what comes up a lot. So he catches my hand, boom, I catch his, I wrench my hand free, I cut, he, if he's good enough, he catches that, which makes perfect sense. Speaking of catching things, that's quite difficult in sparring, not just because it requires a high level of hand-eye coordination, but also because the gear makes it a lot more difficult. Even though I had gauntlets with much better manual dexterity overall, it was still rather difficult, particularly because they are slippery against the synthetic material of the sickles. So it's easy to miss the opponent's arm in the middle of it, and it's also hard to hold on to either the arm or the sickle. I found that in full gear it's easier to push on the opponent's arm instead of trying to get a hold of it. But of course the problem is if you don't grasp the arm, you lose control and might get hit. This is an interesting example of two problems. So first, you see that I have to unhook the sickles when they become stuck, and I actually managed to grab the spine of the sickle. Then Sindri intercepts my cut, but because the gloves don't allow him to hold onto my arm, I can free it easily and cut him in the side. Here as well, I was able to hook his sickle with mine and then grab it, but I wasn't able to maintain control, so he could attack my leg. Here's an odd one. Even though it's uncertain whether he would still be able to use his arm, after receiving that cut, he was able to catch my hand in a way that wouldn't have been possible with a different kind of blade. Trying to control the distance and target the arms can lead to some pretty intense close misses. And it also defeats the rattlesnake technique. So there's some pretty interesting dynamics with sickles, and they actually make for pretty decent weapons. The only problem is, of course, these are not very carryable. At least they would be a lot more awkward to carry around than a knife or dagger, which is why dagger manuscripts are much more common than this. This is exotic. If you wanted to create a rogue or assassin style character in a fantasy setting, this would make a lot of sense in my opinion. You definitely sacrifice a lot of reach, unless of course you were to scale it up and use a sickle sword like the Shotel or Mambele. The Kopesh, by the way, would not work the same way because it's curved in the opposite direction. You just need something to protect yourself, basically. So there are a number of ways in which I can imagine this working. For one, you could modify the sickle design to perhaps add a knuckle guard or even something more complete. One could use heavy gauntlets with it, but then of course the speed is affected negatively. One could have overall a larger guard, and of course one could combine this with a buckler, maybe even a spiked buckler, things like that. So that would work quite nicely. There are a lot of things you can do with this that you can't with other weapons. Lots of hooking, you can attack with a point, you can slice with the blade. In fact, if you wanted to make a more combat-oriented sickle, you could even sharpen the back as well for backhand cuts like this. Now you basically have like an extremely strongly curved Kopesh-like blade that you could use that way. So pretty interesting. Speaking of interesting, let me know what you think about this. This was a lot of work, a lot of preparation, a lot of editing. So I can't do this too often, but let me know if you like this. If there's enough interest, I will turn this into a series. So comment below, tell your friends, all of that good stuff. And thanks for watching.